Emma had always imagined her life with Robert as a fairy tale. When they married, he was charismatic, driven, and considerate, promising her a future filled with love and security. However, over time, Robert's career demands began to take priority, and his attention waned. His corporate job required long hours, and though he provided a comfortable lifestyle, he became emotionally distant. Emma's days turned into a repetitive cycle of household tasks, solitary dinners, and longing for the man who once made her feel vibrant. She missed feeling noticed and valued. Tom, Robert's younger brother, was completely different. At 22, he was lively, carefree, and full of energy. When he moved into their guest room temporarily to save money while searching for a job, Emma initially saw him as just a guest to accommodate. But Tom's effortless charm quickly disrupted her routine. He offered unsolicited help with groceries, teased her about her cooking, and genuinely seemed interested in her thoughts. Emma couldn't help but smile at his youthful energy. One evening, when Robert worked late once more, Emma found herself sharing a cup of tea with Tom in the garden. He opened up about feeling overshadowed by his older brother, the family's golden child. For the first time in ages, Emma felt understood. She confided in him about her loneliness and how she felt like an afterthought in her marriage. Tom listened attentively, his empathy creating an unspoken connection between them. For Emma, it was the first time in years that someone saw her for who she truly was, not just as a wife or homemaker. Neither of them realized it at the time, but that moment marked the beginning of something they couldn't yet define, something that would eventually challenge everything they held dear. As Tom settled into their home, his presence became a welcome distraction for Emma. She found herself laughing more, something she hadn't done in years. Tom's humor and youthful perspective brought life to the otherwise quiet household. He teased Emma about her love of gardening and her penchant for organizing everything to perfection. Emma, who was used to being serious, found his lightheartedness contagious. One afternoon, as they cleaned the attic together, Tom found an old photo album. They sat side by side on the floor, flipping through memories of Robert and Tom's childhood. Tom's stories about their mischievous antics made Emma laugh until her sides ached. For the first time, Emma began to see Tom as more than just her brother-in-law. He was a kindred spirit, someone who understood her loneliness and filled the silence in her life with warmth. Their conversations grew more intimate over time. They shared secrets, hopes, and frustrations. Emma talked about how her marriage had become a shadow of what it once was, and Tom admitted his insecurities about not measuring up to his brother's success. Their shared vulnerability created a bond neither had expected. Although their connection felt natural, Emma couldn't shake the faint feeling of guilt. She reminded herself that their interactions were innocent, a sister-in-law comforting her husband's brother. But late at night, as Robert worked on his laptop, Emma couldn't ignore the flutter of excitement she felt when thinking of Tom. She told herself it was harmless, but the line between friendship and something more was starting to blur. Tom began finding subtle ways to spend more time with Emma. He'd linger in the kitchen while she cooked, cracking jokes and helping her chop vegetables, even when she insisted she didn't need help. His compliments became more personal. "You have such a calming presence," he'd say. Or, "It's hard to believe you're 32. You look much younger." Emma would laugh off his comments, but inside, she felt flattered. Emma, too, began to change. She started putting more effort into her appearance, wearing her hair down more often, choosing outfits that highlighted her figure. She told herself it was to boost her own confidence, but deep down, she knew she enjoyed Tom's lingering glances. One evening, they sat down to watch a film while Robert was away on a business trip. The movie's romantic plot echoed the growing tension between them. As their hands brushed while reaching for the popcorn, a silence filled the room. Emma quickly laughed it off, but her heart raced. Tom, too, seemed flustered, clearing his throat and shifting uncomfortably. From that moment on, their dynamic shifted. The casual banter took on a playful tone, laced with subtle flirtation. Tom started texting more often. During the day, Emma would send memes or check in on her day. However, she found herself glancing at her phone more often, eagerly awaiting his messages. Despite this, Emma clung to the belief that their interactions were harmless. She reassured herself that Tom was simply filling the gap left by Robert. Yet, every time Tom flashed her a smile, her heart fluttered, hinting at something deeper. Unknowingly, they were edging closer to a boundary that, once crossed, could never be undone. The playful exchanges between Emma and Tom kept intensifying, though neither of them openly addressed it. They existed in a state of silent tension, each aware of the growing bond, yet unwilling to confront it. The turning point arrived one afternoon when Tom offered to help Emma rearrange the living room furniture. What began as a practical task quickly turned into a playful tug-of-war over a heavy armchair. Laughing and breathless, they collapsed onto the couch, the room filled only with the sound of their heavy breathing. Tom glanced at Emma, his gaze lingering a moment too long. He reached out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, and Emma froze. Her pulse quickened as their eyes locked, a mix of fear and excitement flooding her senses. The moment was shattered by the sound of Robert's car pulling into the driveway. Emma jumped to her feet, heart racing. "We should finish up," she murmured, avoiding Tom's eyes. But the damage was done. Both knew the dynamic between them had shifted, and it couldn't be undone. Over the next few days, Emma couldn't shake the image of that moment. She tried to justify it, telling herself it was just a fleeting lapse in judgment. But every time she saw Tom, the tension between them was palpable. Tom, emboldened by their shared experience, found subtle ways to touch her, his hand brushing her back as he passed, or his fingers grazing hers when he handed her a glass of water. Emma recognized how dangerously close they were to crossing a line, yet a part of her didn't want to stop. The attention Tom gave her was intoxicating, a reminder of who she once was before life became so routine. The night they crossed the line began like any other. Robert had called to say he'd be working late, leaving Emma and Tom alone for dinner. They ate in silence at first, the air thick with tension. Finally, Tom broke the silence with a joke, and Emma couldn't help but laugh. For a moment, it felt good to laugh, to forget the complicated emotions swirling inside her. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Emma poured herself a glass of wine and offered one to Tom. The conversation started innocently, but as the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew charged. Tom, emboldened by the wine, inched closer to Emma on the couch. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said softly. "Robert's lucky to have you." Emma looked at him, her heart racing. "I don't feel incredible," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Before she could say anything more, Tom leaned in, his lips brushing hers. Emma's first instinct was to pull away, but the longing she had buried for so long overwhelmed her. The kiss deepened, and in that instant, all the reasons why it was wrong seemed to vanish. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "We can't," Emma began, but the words felt empty. Tom simply nodded, yet neither of them moved. That night, their connection entered forbidden territory, and there was no turning back. Later that night, Emma lay awake in bed, guilt and exhilaration battling within her. She knew she should feel ashamed, but instead, she felt more alive than she had in years. Little did she know, the choices made that night would ignite a series of events that would alter their lives forever. In the days that followed, Emma and Tom were swept into a whirlwind of emotions. Their stolen moments became bolder, lingering touches in the hallways, secretive smiles during meals, and whispered conversations in quiet corners of the house. All of these fueled the fire of their growing affair. The thrill of their forbidden connection was intoxicating, but it was also tainted with an undercurrent of fear. Emma felt more alive than she had in years. Tom's attention made her feel desired and appreciated in a way she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage. He spoke to her with a tenderness that reignited a spark within her. Yet, alongside the exhilaration came guilt. Every time Robert came home, exhausted, and kissed her on the cheek, Emma felt a pang of remorse. She convinced herself that Robert's neglect was to blame for her actions, but the excuse felt hollow. Tom, on the other hand, began to feel the weight of their secret. While deeply infatuated with Emma, the reality of betraying his brother gnawed at him. He started avoiding calls from their parents, fearful they'd sense something was wrong. He even began leaving the house for hours to clear his mind, but no matter how far he went, the pull toward Emma was irresistible. The affair continued in secrecy, each encounter more passionate than the last. Yet the risk of being discovered hung over them. Emma became hyper-aware of Robert's schedule, ensuring their moments together remained hidden. Tom too grew anxious, but he couldn't bring himself to end things. The thrill was too addictive, and the emotions were too real. Though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew their actions were unsustainable. Sooner or later, the truth would surface, and when it did, the fallout would be devastating. As the weeks passed, Emma and Tom's secret became harder to conceal. The strain of leading a double life began to take its toll on Emma. She became defensive and irritable, snapping at Robert over minor issues. Robert, oblivious to the true cause of her behavior, attributed it to her frustration with his long work hours. Feeling guilty, he decided to make an effort to reconnect with his wife. One evening, Robert surprised Emma with plans for a weekend getaway. "Just the two of us," he said, smiling warmly. "We need this." Emma hesitated, torn between her guilt and the flicker of hope that perhaps they could repair their marriage. She agreed, though the thought of leaving Tom behind made her heart ache. During the trip, Robert opened up in a way Emma hadn't expected. Over dinner, he admitted that he had been so focused on work because he wanted to provide a secure future for them. "I know I've been distant," he said, reaching for her hand, "but I'm doing it all for us." His words struck a chord with Emma. She realized how far apart they had grown and how little effort she had made to bridge the gap. Meanwhile, Tom was left alone in the house, consumed by guilt and longing. He replayed their moments together in his mind, torn between the intensity of his feelings for Emma and the shame of betraying his brother. For the first time, he questioned whether their affair was worth the damage it could cause. The cracks in their facade were widening, and both Emma and Tom knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The affair came to a sudden and heartbreaking end. One afternoon, Robert came home earlier than expected, eager to surprise Emma with flowers, a gesture of love inspired by their weekend trip. As he entered the house, he heard soft laughter coming from the living room. Curious, he followed the sound and froze in the doorway. Emma and Tom were sitting close on the couch, their heads bent together in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. When Emma looked up and saw Robert standing there, the color drained from her face. "Robert," she began, but he raised a hand to silence her. The confrontation that followed was explosive. Robert demanded the truth, and Emma, unable to deny it any longer, confessed. Tom tried to take responsibility, admitting his role and apologizing profusely, but Robert was inconsolable. The betrayal cut deeply, not just as a husband, but as a brother. Robert's heartbreak was clear as he ordered both Emma and Tom to leave the house. Emma begged him, trying to explain how neglected she had felt, but her words only seemed to deepen his pain. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking with both anger and sorrow. Both Tom and Emma, filled with shame and regret, packed their belongings that evening and left for their parents' house. Emma also found herself leaving the home that had once been her refuge, moving in with a friend as she tried to make sense of her decisions. The household was broken, and the damage to their relationships appeared irreparable. The truth was exposed, and there was no turning back. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the revelation was felt by everyone involved. Living apart from Robert, Emma was forced to face the reality of her actions. She began therapy to understand why she had allowed herself to cross such a devastating line. Through painful self-reflection, she realized that her feelings of neglect had clouded her judgment, blinding her to the harm she was causing. Tom returned to his parents' home where he faced their judgment. Though he didn't fully reveal the extent of what had transpired, his parents sensed something was wrong. He struggled to regain his sense of self, haunted by the knowledge that he had betrayed his brother's trust. Meanwhile, Robert was left to piece together the fragments of his life. Although deeply hurt, he tried to focus on his work and his own healing. Friends and family rallied around him, offering support, but the betrayal weighed heavily on his heart. Emma reached out to Robert several times, but he remained distant. She wrote him a letter, sincerely apologizing and expressing hope that he might one day forgive her. "I know I've caused you unbearable pain," she wrote, "but I hope you can find peace, whether or not I'm part of your life." Tom also wrote to Robert, acknowledging his mistakes and asking for forgiveness. He promised to work on himself and rebuild the trust he had shattered. The wounds were deep, and healing seemed like a distant possibility, but each of them began to take small steps toward rebuilding their lives. Although the scars of their choices would remain forever, they each hoped to become better versions of themselves. Months later, Emma and Robert met at a small cafe to discuss the details of their separation. It was the first time they had seen each other since the affair was revealed. Robert, still hurt, appeared calmer and more composed. Emma had changed as well. Therapy had helped her understand the root of her unhappiness, and she was determined to take responsibility for her actions. "I'm sorry," Emma said, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Not just for what I did, but for not fighting harder for us before it came to this." Robert nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I loved you, Emma. I still do in some way, but trust is something I don't know if we can rebuild." Their conversation ended on a civil note, though it was clear their paths were diverging. Emma left the cafe with a heavy heart, but newfound determination to rebuild her life. She vowed to learn from her mistakes and never let her emotions lead her to such destructive choices again. Tom, on the other hand, was still working to repair his relationship with Robert. Though they hadn't spoken directly, he sent Robert a heartfelt letter, expressing his regret and hope for reconciliation. It would take time, but Tom was committed to earning back his brother's trust. The story ended not with a perfect resolution, but with a lesson: the importance of communication, boundaries, and self-awareness in relationships. Emma and Tom's choices had caused irreparable harm, but they also served as a painful reminder that true connection requires honesty and effort. Though the scars of their actions would remain, each of them moved forward with the hope of becoming wiser and better versions of themselves.